Gerardi, who's had a long and storied career with the Fish and Wildlife Department. He's actually had 37 years of state service, and for about the last 29 years or so, he's been a district fisheries biologist at the St. Johnsbury office. He's a font of knowledge for the Northeast Kingdom, and I think he'll give us a good story about the Clyde River here today. So take it away, Lenny. Oh, by the way, I was also asked to present you with this little token of Lake Champlain United's appreciation because you're very lucky to have him here because he's retiring at the end of next week.
Now, because I'm coming down from the northern border country over here to the west coast, I thought maybe this was like, a passport or a visa.
That's the key to get back.
Well, thank you. We'll see what's in that. Okay, Brian's got it. I'm one of your two district fisheries biologists up in the Northeast Kingdom, where I've been for a really long time. And I'm going to talk today about the Clyde River, Lake Memphremagog, and its salmon. See if I can get the hang of this. So, because I'm kind of off the reservation, even though I know some of you folks are quite familiar with the Northeast Kingdom and Memphremagog and the Clyde, I'll give you a little bit of a travelogue here. So, Lake Memphremagog, pretty good sized lake, straddling the Vermont-Quebec border. It's one of those places, again, where the rivers flow north. You've heard that, I'm sure. So we're, like Champlain, we're part of the St. Lawrence drainage, in our case up through the Magog River and out the St. Francis River, way up to Drummondville. So Memphremagog has a long history with Atlantic salmon, though it's an unsettled question, maybe a little bit arguable, as to whether salmon were native to Lake Memphremagog and the Northeast Kingdom drainage basin, mainly the tributaries, the big tributaries, the Black, the Barton, the Clyde, and the Johns. What we do know for sure is that even though there's not a good record of them being present towards the latter half of the 1800s, we do know that landlocked Atlantic salmon from Maine were stocked in the Vermont portion of the basin. And by the first decades of the 1900s, they were well established as a spawning population in the lower part of the Clyde River in Newport. And they were a tremendous regionally renowned fishery, as you could see by all those people fishing off the bridge. They are actually salmon fishing. Some of the fish that were caught back in those 20s and 30s were of legendary size, as you might gather from that photo there. We have some old records of fish, even though they maybe weren't reliable weights. The length-weight relationships or length-girth relationships suggested they were in the mid to upper teens, big fish. And there's a long memorialized written record of the history of the Clyde. Some of it written more recently, but that there is National or Vermont Life in spring 1950. So salmon go back there a ways. So I might be speaking to people who know more about this than I do, but we'll do a little quick walk through the life cycle of landlocked Atlantic salmon. So adult salmon in Lake Memphremagog swim upstream to spawn in the Clyde River in the fall. The hens, the females, will seek out fast-moving water with clean, gravelly bottoms. They'll dig a nest or a redde, deposit their eggs in it, some attendant male, and maybe 2 or 3 little 10-inch sneakers are going to get in there and fertilize those eggs. She'll cover them up. They'll incubate over the winter, hatch out in the spring. Those hatchlings will wiggle up out of the gravel, spread out over the gravel, feeding, and as they grow, they'll be territorial. They'll spread out over more and more of the riverbed. They're going to spend 2 years, 2 growing seasons in the river, growing up to about 6 inches. They go through a transformation of sorts, become a smolt, so-called. They get the migratory urge, and in the spring of the year, they migrate back out to the lake. In the lake, they're going to spend 2 growing seasons growing to maturity, most of them, coming back, as I said, after the 2nd growing season to the river to spawn. In the case of females, it may take a 3rd growing season before they do come back. So the Clyde has had a long history, like just about every other piece of moving water in New England, with mills and mill development, damming and whatnot. This is actually on the Clyde. For those of you who actually know the Clyde and maybe fish the salmon in the fall, that's almost in the location of where the Newport number 1, 2, 3 powerhouse is. And even in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was some limited hydroelectric generation going on. And this is interesting because this is at the same time that salmon were becoming established in the Clyde and becoming a really vibrant population. However, by the time we get into the 30s, salmon are beset with some pretty, start to be beset with some pretty significant challenges, mostly in the form of expanding hydropower development. In this case, I apologize, boy, when you blow these things up pretty bad, but that was the construction of the Newport number 11 dam in the early 1950s. So changes to river flows through generation, a switch to peaking power, additional damming that actually destroyed some of the riverine habitat. Population started to decline, fisheries started to decline. This is through the late 30s, early 40s, into the 50s. We did manage in the 20s and 30s to strip spawners, take fertilized eggs, and actually develop a brood stock, captive brood stock in a number of hatcheries. And so from then up virtually to the present, the population in the fishery has been supported by stocking. And at the present time, as we have for quite a number of years, we stock 30,000 smolts in the lower Clyde, in the Newport area, and about 50,000 fry up in the middle river. And this was actually part of the strip-in operation on the Clyde back in the 20s and 30s, where we did manage to develop that brood stock. Come around the late 80s, the hydropower system on the Clyde came up for federal relicensing, and this gave the state and the public an opportunity to basically make the case about the damage that development on the river had done to the salmon population, and to basically look for some improvements through the relicensing process. And then, I will say almost miraculously, in the middle of this relicensing process, in the spring of 1994, the Newport number 11 dam, again, terrible, I don't know whether it'd be any better with the light off, but the lowest dam on the river actually failed. It washed out, and it was like amazing that this should happen. Yeah, slightly better. The utility, was Citizens Utilities Company at the time, made some quick efforts to repair the dam. They were actually supported by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. But as a result of activism, engagement, and dedication by a bunch of local anglers, we'll call them the heroes of the Clyde, they manage, supported basically by folks nationally and National TU and a bunch of other organizations. They managed to thwart the rebuilding of that dam, and in fact managed ultimately to see the feds order the removal of the dam. So in 1996, the remnant of the dam was removed and resulted in the river coming back to the same configuration it had in the pre-1950, and in fact flow regime that was probably pre-1930. So that brings us to today. One of the things about trout and salmon generally, ones that rely on the lake or the ocean, is that the population in the lake is going to be, its size is going to depend almost directly on the amount of juvenile fish that can be produced from the river system. Just for illustration purposes, in our case with Lake Memphremagog, just so happens this roughly 25,000 acre, 30-mile long lake, most of which is in Quebec, is divided up. It's a little bit like southern Lake Champlain and the main lake. All of the deep cold water habitat, basically the summertime salmon and trout habitat, is north of the border. Starts 2 miles north of the Vermont-Quebec border. Shallow water in the south, basically it's a transit area, and we're a place where we can see adult fish seasonally. And all of the reproduction relies on the tributary system in the south in Vermont. So whether we want it or not, whether we like it or not, we're basically in kind of a partnership with our neighbors to the north on our salmon. So given that you need to have space in the river habitat in order to populate that great big lake out there, it's important that fish have access. There is spawning and nursery habitat in what I call the lower river. That's basically right in downtown Newport. And there's more up in the middle river, which is Derby and Charleston. Unfortunately, there's some barriers to migration, like the Clyde Pond Dam, mainly the Clyde Pond Dam. That just gives you some references to something I'll talk about later, the fish ladder. And so, having the adults having access to the upper reach of the river is critically important. This just gives you some idea of the available habitat for spawning and nursery in the lower river and what's available in the middle river. Middle river being basically from Clyde Pond up here to West Charleston. So this is available if the fish down there in the lake can get to it. So the result of the relicensing was that fish-friendly flows in the Clyde were required, and a way for fish to basically get up and downstream were required. Now, we lost the old curmudgeonly utilities, citizens' utilities. It was replaced by young entrepreneurial hydro. So the new owner actually took over that new license, and first thing they did was they constructed a fish ladder. This was done in 2007, went into operation in the fall of 2007, and that is what we call a easy for me to say, steep path fishway. It actually turns out to be a ladder and truck type facility. So fish ascend that ladder, which is probably about a 30-foot climb, and they end up in a holding tank. Like that. Now, although it's not all, self-directed, the fish doing it, making their way upstream on their own, what this arrangement does enable us to do is gives us an opportunity to examine all of the fish that come up. and to collect a wealth of information on them. So when the way this works out is the utility or the power company really only has the obligation to get the fish upstream, to identify them, to count them, and to truck them. We're interested in a lot more than that, and also we're interested in how effective the passage system is. So when we get our hands on them, we examine them for length, for weight, we sex them. We're also always looking for presence, absence of fins, as well as whether they're carrying any tags. The other thing that we do as part of this evaluation of how well they're negotiating the river in and out is we do tag them with passive inductive transponders, otherwise known as pit tags. Gives you an idea of the gear and the scale. So we're surgically implanting those tags before we truck them and then release them upriver. In this case, for those of you who might know the area, that's up in Derby Center. Now I mentioned those pit tags. Their utility for us is they're a numerically coded tag. Of course, we know the code and we put it in the fish. When those fish make their way back downstream after spawning, or if they just want to come downstream, I'll talk about that later, those tags can be detected when they pass by antennas. These tags aren't the kind of tags that you use, one of these sweep antennas to find out, listen to a beep. It's a passive tag. It's only when they go by an antenna, the antenna sends out a radio frequency signal, tickles the tag, energizes it, the tag reflects back the coded signal, and the antenna is connected to a data logger. So as the fish come back down the river, enter this downstream sluiceway, there's an antenna at the front, there's also an antenna at the back, so we can tell whether a fish comes close to the entrance and doesn't enter it. And then if it does enter and passes through, we can confirm that it comes out. Then they go 1,600 feet downstream, and we have another antenna that's actually deployed right out across the river on a fairly shallow ledge sill. And so we can tell if, for instance, they didn't go through the sluiceway but spilled over the dam, made their way down the river and cross that antenna. So that's tremendous information for us about how the fish are getting up and down. So that was the travel log. Now I guess we'll talk about what we have learned working at the ladder these 9 years. So I mentioned ladder was built, went into operation in 2007. We did not manage closely the ladder. We didn't staff it in 2007. So although we have a count for 2007, we really know fairly little about the fish until 2008. So we've got 9 years of passage operation, 8 years of good records on fish. So the first thing we learned from all this work is counts. Basically everything that comes up the ladder, we get to count, we get to transport upstream. What you can see there is 2015, we had our best year of this time series, by far and away, which was great and was gratifying. I guess it's probably not unlike and maybe not unrelated to what you folks saw over here at Ed Weed Fish Culture Station, which I guess was just off the scale salmon presence. If that old saw ever holds true about you could walk across them on their backs, that's what I hear it was like at the outfall there. One of the other things you see is somewhere around, this 2011 year, we saw an uptick in the number of fish that were showing up at the ladder. And of course, what we would want to immediately conclude is the numbers started going up because we've been operating the fish ladder for 4 years and we're now seeing returns. And unfortunately, that's not the case. We may have had the station operator pay more attention to some of the weir settings at the ladder entrance, and this may be somewhat responsible for fish getting into that ladder a little bit better. It's not clear. It may also just be population dynamics. There were more fish, whatever. But we were certainly grateful to see this increase in numbers. We had a great year in 2012, and then this record year in 2015. The other thing I just want to point out to you is these little red bars. They go with this scale over here inside the blue ones. Those red bars represent fish that actually came up the ladder more than once in a single year. So this means we transported them 5 miles upstream. They didn't drift downstream. They actively swam back downstream sometime in the space of a week and a half, 2-3 weeks. Came all the way down through Clyde Pond Dam, turned around and said, let's go up the ladder again. So, we've had a couple of three-peats even. So this isn't the same year. This isn't a fish that goes out to the lake, spends another growing season. As many as 6% in a year. So it's pretty remarkable. And what this tells us is that these fish can be highly mobile, highly motivated to move, and they're also, at least these adults, are safely and efficiently negotiating their way back downstream in order to come back up the ladder. I like to refer to these, it just so happens they turn out to generally be young males. Now I refer to them as the beer run fish. They get up into Derby and the big guys say, hey, we're going to have a party here, but we're short on beer. Junior, head back down to Newport, restock, come back up. And they say, yeah, yeah. And that's what they do. So, but pretty consistent behavior that we see this. The other thing that we've learned is a lot about the sex ratio of the fish. Now, typically we'd like to think, oh, sex ratio is going to be pretty balanced, 50-50. What we've seen is that at the ladder, the sex ratios are highly skewed towards male fish. I'll talk about this a little bit more later. But this is important because it isn't the numbers of fish that make it upstream that's critical. It's the number of females, so the number of spawning pairs. So for females to be, the red bars, to be underrepresented is, it's not a great thing for the spawning effort upstream. As you can see, we're typically down, in the mid-30s or lower. We had 1 year here where it was nearly balanced, and there was actually may have been a reason for that. Those 30,000 salmon that we stock in the lower river as smokes, these 6-inch guys, the fall before, we give them a year-specific fin clip, just like on Champlain. You guys are familiar with this. So, we're using a rotational fin clip. We go through the left and right ventrals in the adipose in combination, left ventral adipose, right ventral adipose. So we've got a potential 5-year record. When these marked fish, hatchery origin fish, come back to the river and we see them, not only do we have immediate identification as hatchery origin, we've got immediate determination on age as well. So what this is showing you, mainly these brownish oranges bars, are the 2.5-year-old fish. So this is based on, I think, something like about 400, closer to 600 fish, marked fish. You can see the returns are strongly influenced by young fish, 2.5-year-old stocked fish. Okay. The other thing that you can see, ages 4.5 and up, doesn't represent much at all. Now this is cumulative for all years. Those older fish, hardly represented. Even the 3.5-year-old fish, definitely underrepresented. And that's got some implications for us. Because we were able to actually, over the course of these 8 years, measure something like 600 fish, we get a really good picture, accurate picture on the size distribution within the population. And consistent with that 2.5-year-old representation, you're seeing virtually 70, okay, so we got, there's 21 inches, So what I think is, what did I say this was? So everything under 22, that represents 70% of what we actually see at the ladder. On the other hand, what's over 24 inches represents something like 15%. So definitely skewed towards smaller fish. The other thing is just these groups here, basically the 19 and the 20-inch size group is representing half of the fish altogether. If you want to look at the, again, for the fish whose ages we know at this point, we actually take scales off of the unmarked fish, but I don't have the age determinations on all of those at this point. But if you want to look at the over 500 marked fish we've dealt with, and look at the size at age. So there's those 2.5-year-olds. Basically, average on that is about a little over 19.5 inches. And we're seeing fish up to, I think that's like 23.6 or 23.7. So nearly up to 2 feet long at that age 2.5, which is pretty impressive growth, probably rivaling or equaling what you see over here in Champlain. If you get over here to the age 4.5 and older, you know, we're basically talking about fish which are all 24 inches and up. You know, there's a few under that. But basically these are 2-footers and up. Critical thing to look at there is that's how many fish we're talking about. 15 fish over these 8 years that are age 4.5 and up, and that's of concern to us. Your 3.5s, again, much fewer number. You know, we're looking at fish which are probably about 23.5 inches on average. These fish will, as a general rule, be virgin spawners. So it's the first time they are coming back from Lake Memphremagog. They're also probably more apt to be female because mainly males in those 2.5-year-olds. And what's important to recognize in that is that means for this group of fish to reach that age at first maturity, they're going to have to spend another year in the lake. And that's another growing season when they're subject to hooking and harvest, and which is substantial in the lake. I talked about this fin clipping and being able to identify fish as being marked, unmarked. Marked typically meaning of hatchery origin. Not entirely. I mentioned that 50,000 fry that we stock up in the Middle River. Those are unmarked fish. Any of those fish that make it down through to the lake, we won't really be able to distinguish them from wild fish. But at any rate, you know, not especially encouraging. Here we are, you know, 9 years in, and we're still looking at the contribution of wild, or at least unmarked fish, being, you know, pretty much down below 15%. 1 year was a little bit of an uptick there, nearly a quarter, but pretty low. And as a measure of, you know, progress for us, ultimately what we would love to be seeing on the Clyde is higher and higher numbers, but higher percentages of wild fish as well. Now, I talked about the percentage of wild fish. This actually shows the number of wild fish that we're seeing, and you know those numbers are low. So the percentages may even seem a little bit deceptive. So obviously, we'd love to be seeing those numbers increasing. The other thing I showed you percentages of were males versus females. And again, when you actually look at the numbers, relatively new program, I guess we'd have to say, that in some cases, you know, in terms of spawning power, we're talking about hardly any females at all. In fact, 2009, I think there was 10 fish that year. There were no females at all, so all those males up there had nothing to spawn with. We're hoping to see these numbers increase, and this year, 2015, has the highest number of females by far, and that's going to be the highest number of spawning pairs we've seen, and that's a good thing. However, just like it's not all about numbers in terms of spawning power, it's about the females. It's also not all just about the females, but it's about the age and the size of those females as well. And these are real numbers from the lab. This number of females trucked, and as you can see, there's that 57. The best that we've had so far, 57 spawning pairs upriver, compares, basically about 70%, 60% higher than the year before, 33 in 2014. However, those fish, for whatever the reason was in 2015, happened to mainly be 2.5-year-old fish. I think something like 85% of all the fish that came in this record year 2015 were 2.5 years old. Those females were small. So when you actually look at these average weights of these females, these are real weights. We measured them, right? 2.1 pounds. For a female, the number of eggs produced directly proportional to the weight of the fish. Okay, so you double the weight of a fish, you've doubled the number of eggs it has. Reproductive potential is double. So even though 2015 was such a good year for us, we actually had more eggs produced from these fewer but older and larger females in 2014. This is a real simplistic model of what we would hope to happen if, you said you get a certain amount of survival from egg to out-migrating smolt. And then you get a certain amount of survival from smolt in the lake to adult returning to the river. So in this little model here, we're basically saying 3% survival, and I'll tell you where more or less where we come from, where we get that. 3% from egg to smolt. And then I give you two options here. 10% survival from smolt to returning adult, and then 1% smolt to adult, okay? And those are what we might predict as the numbers. So, we might look at 2015 or 14 and say, good year. If we had 10% survival, we might be looking at 350 returning adults coming back to the Clyde, okay? The place where we get that 3% egg to smolt, we can kind of measure and confirm by doing juvenile population sampling upriver. We're looking at the growth and survival of those stocked fry, because we don't have much in the way of wild adults upriver. And then in the green, that is actually wild production in the lower river. And it's kind of bumping around. These are all in terms of habitat units. So we call a unit 100 square meters of available nursery habitat. And so generally speaking, we're somewhere in 1 to 6 per unit, 6 fry per unit range. And if we kind of went back and we went forward, that 3% survival from egg to egg to smolt is probably not unreasonable. Okay, so that was egg to smolt. Now we're going to talk about smolt to returning adult. So this graph here is basically showing you the percent return of stock smolt to adults back to the fish lab. Okay, now you're probably looking at that graph saying, ooh, Lenny forgot to include the data in that. Well, this is on a 100% scale. So if I take that same graph and I put it on a 0 to 20% scale, what you weren't seeing in that other graph is those little red bars over there. 30,000 smolts in, we're looking at something on the order of 10 to, in this case, this year, 200 adults returning. Very small. So, now, a fish that comes into the Clyde River may not get to the ladder. It's about a mile. There's all the spawning and nursery habitat. In the springtime, there's a fishery that involves some harvest. Even in the month of late part of August, in September, there's legally a kill fishery, although not much of that occurs. Okay, so to be fair, it's like, well, okay, not every fish that comes back to the river is going to make it up to the ladder. So what I did was I took those percent returns and I said, well, okay, well, we'll factor it by 4 and we'll factor it by 10. So, you know, either 4 fish that enter the river, maybe 1 makes it up to the ladder. If 10 fish enter the river, maybe 1 makes it up. So as you can see here, 2015, our best year. This is 2014 stocking. We haven't seen the whole picture for 2015. That's only the 2.5-year-olds. 2016, we may be able to add in some 3.5s, maybe some 4.5, 5. You make that cumulative. But right now, best we're doing is 6% of what we're stocking in the lake. Okay, and in most cases, we're looking at, you know, less than 3%. So, does that give us pause? Does that tell us, gee, we've got some, you know, salmon returning to the river, have some challenges in the lake? Well, I guess they do. We get a little bit of an inkling of what those issues may be from what we see at the ladder, and that is a high level of healed hook-in injuries on these fish, missing maxillaries, split jaws, blindness in one eye or the other, all that kind of stuff. Injuries that we believe the fish experienced as freshly out-migrated smolts, that first growing season in the lake. Some of that's happening in Vermont, some of it's happening in Quebec. There's also a booming harvest fishery on the lake in Quebec. It's a different jurisdiction. Now I don't want to vilify our neighbors to the north, which, as I said, are our partners. But we're talking about fairly more liberal rules up in the north. The salmon harvest allowed is 3 versus R2. But the big thing is R2 salmon is 2 salmon in a 2 trout salmon bag. So you fish Lake Memphremagog, you get 1 rainbow and 1 brown, you're done. 1 salmon, 1 laker, you're done. You don't see many lakers, okay? That aggregate bag for trout and salmon in Quebec is 30. Okay. Now, whether that translates into somebody who might be fishing for salmon, staying on the water longer because catching other fish, is hard to say. We are trying to engage with our partners to the north. It's unlikely that we would ever get unified regulations, but we are working maybe on at least getting the salmon regulation the same. The minimum length limit for salmon is 16.5. It used to be 17 like ours, and that was interesting how we did collaboratively arrive at that, but it ended up getting reduced. You know, we may actually be talking with, we are talking about the Quebecers, we may be thinking about even boosting that up if we're actually trying to protect more adults to that first spawning back. Protect some of those fish, those 3.5-year-olds, back to the river, those females that are producing twice as many eggs as the 2.5-year-olds. So, I could go on and talk about the creel surveys we did in '09 showing the increase in interest in people fishing the Clyde in the, especially in the fall, went up from 2009, 2014 by probably 2.5. But I think I'm going to leave it there because Brian's going to talk some. So as I said, well, maybe not the end. It will be the end of the talk, and you know, certainly maybe the future. We'll hope so. But thank you very much. Well, no. Quebec does not stock salmon. So Quebec anglers basically enjoy Vermont's largesse. Okay? we stock them, they harvest. Okay. And that's part of, it's part of how I think we're going to try to approach things with our counterparts up north, okay? If we were to stop stocking salmon, Quebec salmon fishery goes away. There is none. Now, they do have a lake trout fishery. But salmon fishery would go away. We think the salmon fishery is very popular. We would like to engage people on the basis, maybe the business interests, the guides, the municipalities, on the basis of their informed self-interest to support the Quebec government maybe in making some changes. Whether that's going to be in the cards, we really don't know. But we're, as I said, we were just up in Sherbrooke a couple of weeks back, sitting down with our fish biologist counterpart. He's sympathetic. You know, we're also all realistic about, you know, what you can accomplish in the rulemaking forum. You know, might not be something the Quebec anglers are interested in. So, I'll be, yes, sir.
Glenn, any interest in stocking the other bigger trips we talked about?
Well,
Landlocked?
it's in the back. What we are seeing, though, is some wild production here and there. I got a bunch of anecdotal reports about salmon being caught in the Barton River. In some of our sampling, we picked up a couple of odd fry, I mean, completely random stuff. It's like, wow, that's a salmon fry. If it doesn't happen on its own, maybe there really is something steamrolling here. And I didn't tell you, it's 4 years from the time a spawner comes to the ladder and the time a returning adult comes back to the ladder. So when you start first seeing those numbers, 2011, the first time we might have seen a return from those bigger numbers would have been 2015, and it in all likelihood would have been a male. Okay? So 2016 might begin the snowball. Let's hope. You get those wild fish come back, they go upriver, they spawn, their offspring might have, we hope, theoretically, they would have that stronger imprint, that stronger genetic connection to that upriver area and want to go up. There may be a lot of fish in the lower Clyde that never get to the ladder because they're content spawning below. There's a couple little tributaries that come in. They may sense those tributaries, the smell, and say, I'm home. This is good spawning habitat, I don't have to go any further. So to get those fish above, get their offspring above, that may be the key.